1956, a small town near Stuttgart. In a low concrete schoolhouse, still smelling faintly of new paint and coal dust, a 39-year-old mathematics teacher stood at the front of a classroom, chalk in hand. On the blackboard he wrote in neat, naval-trained script, linear equations. In his breast pocket, hidden behind the fabric of an inexpensive jacket, a battered notebook carried a different kind of calculation. In it, the man once known to U-boat command as Capitaine Lieutenant Heinrich F., Knight's Cross recipient, now simply Herr F. Lehrer, had written the sentence that defined his new life. At sea, I sent men to the bottom without seeing their faces. Here, in class, every pair of eyes feels like a verdict. He had once commanded a steel cylinder with 50 men hundreds of meters below the surface, hunting convoys by sound and mathematics. Now he tried to explain fractions to children born into ruins and reconstruction. The Battle of the Atlantic had ended a decade earlier. For him, in some ways, it had not ended at all. It had just changed depth. The war that taught him to kill by numbers. 1942, North Atlantic. In the conning tower of UH, spray freezing on metal, Heinrich peered through the UZO sight at a convoy outlined against a moonlit horizon. He had been 25 when he took command. The sea was his element, mathematics his weapon. He had joined the Navy in the late 1930s, drawn by the prestige of the Kriegsmarine, the allure of U-boat comradeship, a vague belief shared by many that serving his country at sea was somehow cleaner than the war on land. On patrol, life was simple in its brutality. Hydrophone reports became bearings. Bearings became firing solutions. Firing solutions became torpedo loss. A merchant ship exploded in flame. In his logbook it was recorded as Nero 3017, hit amidships. Ship broke in two. Sunk. Tonnage. Type. Position. No faces. No screams, except in memory. U-boat propaganda, carefully cultivated by Dönitz and Goebbels, told him he was an elite warrior striking at the lifeline of perfidious Albion. His world shrank to periscope optics, depth gauges, orders from BDU Boat Command. He knew, abstractly, that men died in the cold, dark water. He had seen through the lens tiny dots, lifeboats, debris. He forced himself to lower the periscope. You cannot conduct war if you dwell on every face. At least that is what he told himself. The mathematics of his war were brutal and clean. Tonnage sunk per patrol, torpedoes fired versus hits, men lost in his own boat versus kills achieved. He did not know then that those same talents for abstraction would later become his curse. Defeat by starvation and depth charges. By 1943, the tide had turned. Allied radar, HFDF, long-range aircraft, improved convoy tactics terms that arrived in grim signals from home as reasons why boats did not return. U-boats that had sailed out past the Bay of Biscay did not send their usual signals. In mess halls and on bases in occupied France, photographs of lost crews multiplied on walls. At sea, Heinrich's patrols grew shorter, more desperate. He experienced the textbook terror of the German submarine war, hours of depth charges hammering the hull, lights flickering, air thick with diesel and sweat, men lying silently on bunks, listening for the sound of screws fading. He lost men. He returned to port with dents in his boat and decorations on his chest. Admiral shook his hand. Goebbels' newsreels filmed heroic shots of conning towers. The reality behind those images, by war's end, over 70% of U-boat crews would be dead, one of the highest casualty rates of any German branch. Men he had trained, eaten with, joked with in cramped mess spaces, simply did not return from next patrols. In the last months of the war, with fuel scarce and Allied air power dominant, his boat was ordered into Norwegian ports, then inland. He received curt, coded signals, scuttle if necessary, prepare for ground defense. The ocean that had defined his adult life receded. He found himself on land, in a collapsing Reich that called on naval officers to command improvised infantry units against Soviet tanks. He refused a suicidal last stand, citing the uselessness of sacrificing trained men for lost cause. It was perhaps his first real act of disobedience. It would not be his last. Capitulation and the sudden shift from hunter to prisoner. May 1945. The order came, all U-boats cease offensive operations, surrender to Allied forces. For a man whose identity fused with his boat, the words were not just a tactical signal, they were a personal disintegration. He directed his crew to paint black surrender bands on the conning tower, to issue personal weapons into storage. An Allied destroyer took him in tow into a Scottish port. British sailors stared, some with curiosity, some with hatred. On the quay, cameras clicked. In a holding camp, he filled out a prisoner of war form. Rank, Capitaine Lieutenant. Branch, Kriegsmarine, U-boats. Kriegsmarine, U-boats. Convoys attacked, classified. He expected harshness. He received something stranger, food. Blankets, interrogations that sounded, at times, more like technical conferences than vengeance. British and American officers asked in great detail about torpedo reliability, periscope optics, schnorchel performance. They were less interested, it seemed, in whether he felt remorse than in whether their own navies could learn from his experience, he answered. Partly out of professionalism. Partly because talking tactics was easier than thinking about deckloads of drowning men. In the camp, rumors circulated. Some former U-boat officers would be tried as war criminals for machine-gunning survivors. Others would quietly go home after a period of captivity. He had never ordered firing on lifeboats. He clung to that fact like a rosary bead of decency. He did not interrogate too deeply whether torpedoing fully loaded merchant ships in mid-Atlantic, far from rescue, was morally different in kind. Abstraction remained his shield. Return to a landlocked, ruined country. 1947-1948. Released from British captivity, he returned to a Germany that barely resembled the nation he had sailed for. The West, occupied by Americans, British, French, the East by Soviets. Cities flattened, Hamburg, Cologne, Stuttgart, Dresden. Millions displaced. The currency worthless, the navy dissolved. No Kriegsmarine to return to, no conning tower to climb. In his parents' village near Stuttgart, he found his father's workshop destroyed by bombing. His mother aged beyond her years. An entire generation of young men missing or maimed. On walls and in newsreels, images from Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz confronted Germans with crimes many had not wanted to know in detail. He had known nothing of gas chambers, industrial extermination. He had heard rumors of harsh measures in the East, of Einsatzgruppen, of things best left unsaid. Seeing the images, he felt something within him give way. He had served loyally in a navy that flew the same flag as those camps. He had believed, sincerely, that his war was separate, cleaner. The pictures kneecapped that illusion. His internal argument shifted. I did not know. Competed with, I should have asked. Neither gave much comfort. Denazification tribunals demanded forms. He filled out his Fragebogen, Bocken, Cloud. Denazification, Cloud Genaz? Party member? No. SA, SS? No. Higher ranking. He was categorized as Mitläufer, a follower, not a major offender. He received a piece of paper essentially saying, you may participate in the new society. He tucked it into a folder with his discharge papers, decorations, U-boat logbook. New identities require documents. So do old ones. retraining the warrior from torpedo tables to algebra. In the late 1940s, the newly forming Dictatorship authorities, under Allied oversight, rebuilt civilian institutions, schools, courts, hospitals. Teachers were in short supply. Many pre-war teachers were tainted by Nazi indoctrination or dead. Others simply lacked the authority or training needed. The nascent Federal Republic launched programs to retrain returning soldiers as teachers, engineers, civil servants. Heinrich, with his Naval Academy education heavy in mathematics and navigation, fit. He enrolled in a Pädagogische Akademia, teacher training college. In lecture halls that smelled of chalk and cheap coffee, he sat on wooden benches alongside men much younger than him. Professors spoke of democratic pedagogy, the duty to raise citizens who questioned authority. New curricula stripped of racial nonsense and Führer worship. He listened, sometimes with genuine interest, sometimes with a cynicism he could not entirely shed. He thought, "You want me, who followed orders into the Atlantic without question, to raise children who will question men like me." It was an irony the instructors either did not see or politely ignored. He studied didactics, child psychology, history now framed through words like Unrecht, injustice, and Verbrechen, crime, instead of heroism and sacrifice alone. At night, he tutored himself in textbooks for civilian math, slept in a cheap boarding house, sent money and care packages back to his parents. Reconstruction was physical houses, roads, and mental. The Bundesrepublik needed men like him to genuinely believe, or at least convincingly act, that they were now servants of a law-governed democratic state. For some, this was easy. They had never been true believers. For him, it was more complicated. He had believed in comradeship, discipline, technical mastery. Not exactly Hitler, but the two had been fused. Unfusing them took more than lectures. In the classroom, every name called against a roll of the dead. By the mid-1950s, he stood in front of his first class. Rows of children from war widows, expellee families from the East, returning soldiers, battered households. They carried satchels repaired with string, wore patched clothes, and lived in a West Germany just beginning its Wirtschaftswunder. Economic miracle. New factories hummed. Volkswagens rolled out. Television sets glowed in some living rooms. For his students, war was fragmented memory. Sirens at night, cellars, fathers who never returned. For him, it was sonar pings, condensation dripping in a pressure hull, the sound of depth charges. He wrote equations on the board, set homework, collected notebooks. Yet, beneath the geometry and fractions, a parallel set of calculations ran. How many fathers in this room may have died on convoys he attacked? How many mothers had huddled in blackout as U-boats cut supply lines? He did not know. No roster would ever link his logbook entries to specific families in his class, but he felt the possibility as a constant undercurrent. One day, a boy lingered after class, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Herr F," he asked, "did you fight in the war?" "Yes," Heinrich answered. "Where?" "At sea, in submarines." The boy's eyes widened. "My uncle was lost with his ship. They say a U-boat sank it." Silence. There were hundreds of such ships. The odds were diffuse. The possibility was particular. He could have said, "Many were lost." It was war. He could have hidden behind abstraction again. Instead, he said only, "I am sorry your uncle did not return." The boy nodded, half satisfied, half confused, and left. At home that night, Heinrich opened his old war log, ran his finger down lists of dates and positions. No names, just freighter, estimated 7,000 GRT sunk. He closed the book. In his teacher's gradebook, by contrast, each entry had a full name, marks beside it. different kinds of numbers. He wondered which ledger history would consider more important: veterans' tables and selective memory. In the town's Gasthaus, on Thursday nights, a group of former soldiers gathered at a corner table, Stammtisch. Army, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine. They drank beer, smoked, told stories. Stories edited by time and shame. Eastern Front men spoke of frozen marches, T3 thaws, partisan attacks. Luftwaffe men spoke of dogfights, flak, raids. When conversation turned to politics or atrocities, an agreement settled over the table like cigarette smoke. We did our duty. The criminals were elsewhere, above us, behind desks. Heinrich's U-boat tales had special allure. You cannot see submarines, they are mythic by nature. Men leaned in as he described North Atlantic storms, the frightening beauty of phosphorescence on waves, the deafening clang of depth charges. He skipped certain details, the exact angle at which torpedoes struck a loaded tanker, the shape of silhouettes through the periscope as men jumped. Among themselves, veterans nurtured a narrative. They were professional soldiers, let down by politicians, betrayed by Hitler's madness, overwhelmed by Allied industry. There was truth there. Industrial imbalance had indeed doomed them, but truth carefully sliced around certain facts. The regime they served had been genocidal by design. The war at sea, for all its tactical elegance, was part of that larger project. At the Stammtisch, when talk veered too close to Jews' camps, Einsatzgruppen, someone would say, "Ah, we knew nothing of that then," or "Let's not talk politics, we were just simple soldiers." Heinrich found himself both comforted and repulsed by that phrase. It absolved. It infantilized by that phrase. It avoided. Then he would go home, iron his shirt for school, prepare a lesson on statistics, and wonder what it meant to teach critical thinking when he himself still flinched from certain thoughts. The economic miracle that reconstructed houses faster than consciences. By the late 1950s, West Germany's GDP rose, wages improved, streets were repaved, new apartment blocks rose from rubble. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer emphasized stability, integration into the West, NATO membership. Trials of NATO membership, trials of Nazi crimes did occur, most prominently at Nuremberg, and later in the 1960s at the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt. But for most ordinary Germans in the 1950s, daily life centered on work, rebuilding, forgetting. Heinrich's town gained a new factory, then a supermarket. His students came to school in better shoes with fuller lunchboxes. Some fathers bought cars. Television brought images of a new threat, the 8-H's Cold War, Soviet tanks in Hungary, atomic weapons. Nazism became, in public discourse, increasingly described as an aberration, the work of a criminal clique, something from which the new West Germany had decisively broken. In that story, men like him could be rehabilitated as valuable contributors. Ordinary Germans misled, now doing honest work. He appreciated the chance to live without constant suspicion. He also sensed that this convenient narrative allowed too many to avoid deeper questions. In school, the curriculum cautiously introduced the Nazi period, but often compressed it into a few weeks. Weimar crisis, Weimar crisis, Weimar Weimar, Weimar crisis, Weimar Weimar, crisis, Weimar Weimar. The Holocaust, camps, the participation of ordinary men were touched on lightly, if at all, in his early teaching years. He stuck to the math syllabus, grateful for the abstraction, but uneasily aware that his silence contributed to the same avoidance he saw around him. The economic miracle had repaired roofs. It had not excavated the buried U-boats of conscience. The next generation asks different questions. By the late 1960s, a new cohort sat in his classroom. They had grown up not amid rubble, but amid prosperity. They had watched televised images of Auschwitz trials, Vietnam War, student protests in Berlin and Paris. They were less inclined to accept their parents' generations' "we knew nothing and we just obeyed" explanations. One day, after a lesson, a girl approached his desk with a history textbook under her arm. "Herr F," she said, "you were in the war, yes?" "Yes." "In U-boats?" "Yes." "Our history teacher says the Navy was cleaner than the SS, that you fought soldiers, not civilians." He hesitated. She pressed. "But merchant ships had civilian crews, didn't they? Cooks, radio operators, sometimes women. Did you ever think about them when you fired?" The room seemed to shrink. He could have retreated into veterans' cliches. He could have said, "In war, everyone on an enemy ship is part of the war effort." Or, "We followed the laws of war as best we could." Instead, perhaps tired of decades of evasion, he said quietly, "In the periscope, a ship is a shape with numbers attached, range, speed, bearing. If you let yourself think too much about the people, you cannot do what you are ordered to do, so you learn not to think. That is the most dangerous thing war teaches." She looked at him a moment longer, then nodded, half satisfied, half disturbed. It was not a confession, not an absolution, but it was closer to truth than anything he had said in years. The arithmetic of a life, ships sunk versus students taught. In retirement, he moved to a small flat overlooking fields instead of oceans. His war decorations stayed in a box in the closet, alongside his boat cap and logbook. On the wall hung a photo of a class from 1964, rows of teenagers squinting in sunlight, him standing at the edge, hands behind back. He sometimes took out his old Kriegsmarine paybook and his teaching qualifications, placed them side by side. One represented a youth spent mastering the art of killing at a distance. The other, middle-aged, spent helping children understand the world's patterns in numbers and graphs. He knew that no ledger balanced these things. 10 ships sunk did not equal 10 cohorts taught. 1,000 merchant sailors drowned did not equate to 1,000 students who went on to become engineers, nurses, parents. But the human mind loves equations. He caught himself thinking in them anyway. If he had died with his boat, as so many did, his story would have ended in 1943 with a line in a casualty list. Instead, he had lived another 50 years, part of a West Germany that transformed from pariah to prosperous democracy. He had voted in elections, paid taxes, graded exams. His students, perhaps, learned from him something of discipline, of precision. Maybe some also absorbed his hesitations about authority. In his notebook, on one of the last pages, he wrote, "They say the Federal Republic is a success story. They point to factories, highways, peaceful transfer of power. They like to say, the past is behind us. For men like me, the past is not behind. It is below, like a sunken ship on the sea floor. You sail over it every day, pretending the ocean is empty. But the depth sounder knows it is there. The depth sounder knows it is there." For Heinrich F., it ended, in a sense, every time he looked into a classroom and saw not convoys, but faces. Civil life in a landlocked West German town did not absolve him. It gave him time to think about orders obeyed, time to see what a state looks like when it chooses law over Führer, constitution over command. Time to realize that the most important lesson he ever taught his students was not how to solve equations, but that there are some calculations about obedience, duty, and humanity that should never be reduced to numbers alone.